worship, our text this morning is from Psalm 32. And if you have your Bibles, you can turn to it, but it won't help you very much because I've translated it differently than your text. Quite intentionally. So we have a discipleship program that meets in the morning before our worship time, and the subject was justification. And it was from Romans, the book of Romans, a letter of the New Testament, in its 4th chapter. And in that little text there, which we just read before that beautiful song in Romans 4, this psalm is quoted. So Paul, this preacher, this teacher of the New Testament, he goes back to the psalm and the experience of David in this psalm to bring out a theological truth. And that theological truth, I am hoping today, will penetrate our hearts. Now, some of us are skeptics about spiritual experience. And so I'm going to want to walk through this psalm, and I'm hoping that you will, if you're skeptical, you will become at least curious about the validity of spiritual experience for yourself. But some of us are a bit cynical. Perhaps we believe things, but we're cynical about their truth or power or relevance. Well, I'm hoping today that the spiritual experience of this psalm, the mysterious spiritual encounter that this poem is, will be a journey and a story that you want to take too. And third, there's the saint. And some of us are saints or seekers and saints, and I'm hoping that you will refresh your joy. I think there's a well of refreshing joy to be had for a lot of us as believers when we walk into spiritual experience of a man like David. So we got a lot going on today in this text, and I translate it. Now let's turn to it's in your bulletins, and I want to draw your note to a few translations, the true translation choices I made. In the first few verses, in the first 5 verses, I took the ESV's translation of the word sin and the word transgression and the word iniquity, which are all very religious terms, aren't they? Iniquity, transgression, sin. Those are churchy words. The Hebrew is very blunt, by the way. The Hebrew is for the word, one of the words is hatah for transgression, I believe. Yes, transgression is, it just means, that means rebellion. That's Pesach. The second word there, failure, means, it's translated sin in the ESV, but it just means missing the mark, not living up to the standard. The third word is, which is translated iniquity in our modern Bibles, in the Elect Standard Version. That's a joke. That's an inside joke. Is iniquity. That's a terrible English word. We don't know what that means at all. And really what it means in the Hebrew is very blunt. It means distorted, twisted, bent. Now I'm hoping that this translation will alert you to the true nature of sin. Like getting past some of the religious overtones that hide our sin from us, hide our brokenness and our ruin from us. And when our brokenness and our ruinedness is hidden from us, we can't access joy. We can't access the spiritual experience of David. It's hidden from us. And theological truth can hide things from us because it's not practical truth. It doesn't hit us in the heart. So that's the first thing, the translation. And I translated God's sacred name in the Old Testament as I am. What I want to draw your attention to after this is some of the structures here, and then we'll just kind of dive in. I want you to be able to read this poetically as it's written. I don't know what I do with my glasses. Oh, there they are. If you'll see verse 5, which you'll be reading, which is bold text, is actually a little miniature poem inside the poem. And it's called a chiasm. What that means is that Hebrew poetry is written like a chocolate, like your chocolates in a sampler. It has a chocolate shell and then it has an interior creamy nougat filling. And you'll see it goes failure, distorted, rebellions, and then it goes twisted and then falling short. I'm using different words to make the English language translation easier to read. I want to draw some other attention. Look at the verse 1 and 2. They're blessed. These are blessing statements. And then in verse 9 through 11, it's answered with command statements. They balance each other out. This is Hebrew poetry does. It doesn't do rhyme couplets like or quatrains like Shakespearean sonnets. It does balance, back and forth. Look at verse 3 and 4. I kept silent. It's all interior. And then look at verse 8. It's all outward. This is all very intentional design to the poet's meaning. And the poetic design of the text is meant to be a way of accessing its meaning. So the first 5 verses are all about sin, and then verses 6 through 11 are about joyfully going out and in holiness. So see if we can connect these together. I'm going to read the plain text. If you'll respond with the bold text. Let's read this together. Blessed is the one whose rebellion is forgiven, whose failure is covered.
Blessed is the man against whom I am comes no twistiness, and in whose spirit there are no lies.
For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long and night. Your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer.
I acknowledge my failure to you, and I did not cover my disordered life. I said, I will confess my rebellions to I am, and you forgave the twistedness of my falling short.
Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him.
You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of rescue.
I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you.
Not like a horse or a mule without understanding.
Which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will not stay near you.
Many are the sorrows of the evil, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in I am.
Be glad in I am, and rejoice, O righteous, and
shout for joy, all you upright in heart.
Let's, if this is a spiritual experience that's accessible, then we need to pray for it, right? We need to have spiritual eyes to experience it. So let's pray. Let's seek this God. Dear Father, as I look at this text and look out in this room, I know that I just know how our hearts are and how some of us are longing to have joy, to have a spiritual experience of joy that's like this, and how often many of us have not had it. Father, I pray that you would make, I'm asking you to make this a spiritual event like no other. For some of us, a moment of new life, a moment of spiritual awakening. For others, a moment of refreshment, a spiritual refreshing. For some, a moment of new confession of sin. And for others, perhaps the first time they've ever realized they were sinful, realized the ruin and brokenness of their hearts. Only you can do this, Father. So I ask you to do it. Help me to speak well and to speak in a way that's helpful to people and help us to hear. And I pray this, I ask this, I come to you in Jesus. Amen. So I was reminded when I was preparing this today about the woman who came home from church, and her husband asked her, what was the sermon about? And she said, sin. And her husband said, well, what did he say about sin? And she said, he was against it. He was against it. So if you get anything today, that's your takeaway. I'm thinking about this today because my goal, my hope is to take us through this psalm. And what that has to begin with is a new and deeper, a more significant, perhaps for some of you, the first realization of the nature of your spiritual brokenness. I believe that if we are able to access this brokenness in a new way, we will in turn, and as a result, be able, for perhaps the first time in a long time, to see God's justifying, well, this is a word we're using here, His amazing love. How remarkable it is that God moves towards us in love the way He does. And then if we see that, we will enter into a praise that is radiant. We will enter into a work of discipling and evangelizing. These are Christian words. They're very much part of Christian community. But they are the words of touching one another with this experience. Touching one another because this experience has happened at such a profound level. So that's the sermon, and it's three main points. One, that I want to know God's love. I want you to know and experience God's love the way David does. And that will begin by a recognition of your brokenness. It will then expand by an amazing recognition of the wonders of God's love, which then in turn will also create an earnest desire and pursuit of others. It's very simple. And that's the progression of the psalm. I began this, the reason this began was out of a study. I was preparing some documents, and I was working on them. And a mentor of mine had reviewed my vision statement, and he gave me a criticism. And his criticism was that I didn't mention in my vision statement anything about sin. I didn't use the word sin or sinner. I got a little defensive. I got a little defensive, and I said, well, wait a second, I talked about idolatry. And one of the reasons I did that was intentional, because if there's something that's true about Atlanta in our context, and in the context of a lot of modern people, they're not very sensitive or not very aware or not very connected to an idea of sin. In your therapy work, Don, you don't use the word sin very much, do you? It's just not a word it's a distinctively religious word. I don't even know that it's a spiritual one to us. And so it tends to be unfathomable or unreachable or it's something that's not understood by a lot of the modern mind. So I use the word idolatry. When I talk to my neighbors who are living together, talking about the sin of some sort of sin that's in their lifestyle, kind of raises kind of a distance immediately. Like, sounds judgmental. But if I talk about idolatry, if I talk about idols that you seek and worship and chase, and how destructive that search and chase really is, you get a recognition. Okay, yeah, I can see that I have idols. So I was being a little defensive, and I said that to him. But then I thought, I wonder what the Old Testament words are for sin. I don't know why. I realized I couldn't just say what they were. And I thought, I'll do some study. And I was led to Psalm 32, because Psalm 32 in his wisdom, the poet uses different words. Why? Why does he use these different words? Because as he's exploring his spiritual experience, he can't just take a word or even just a religious word and capture it. And so I thought this became a place for us to rediscover some spiritual joy, because that's what happens in this poem. He moves from an understanding about who he is and what his wretchedness is, what his spiritual poverty, what it consists in, and he moves toward joy. I mean radical joy at the end. A radical, explosive joy that is calling and commanding everybody around him to participate. So that's what I was hoping we would do today. So let's begin with this problem. I said we have a problem. I said, what's the sermon? It's about sin today. It's about sin. And I'm against it. But I was really compelled in the biblical study, to think more deeply than I'd ever had before. What's the first word I want to draw your attention to is the general word. It's the word for failure. It's used 3 times in this text. And I translate it as falling short in failure, missing the mark. In the Greek, actually has a great Greek word, hamartia, and the Hebrew word are very, very similar. And they describe what is honestly probably the most universal experience, and I think even of this generation, and that's what? I didn't make the mark. I'm a failure. You know, I don't know whether it's because you have an understanding of God's standards. Maybe some of you have an inkling of God's standards and you realize you don't reach them, but we don't even need those, do we? How many of you fail to reach your own standards? I mean, the very things you think are really important. Being a hard worker, being an honest man, being a faithful friend. And how many times are you haunted by I mean, we don't even need God's righteous standards, what he calls his holy and perfect law, in order to condemn us, do we? We could use our own mouths. We could use our own standards, and we'd be devastated. And if there's a universal human experience, I just didn't make it. And then moms feel this every day. I don't know if I've been a good mom. And dads feel it when they're about their wives and about their families as they get old. I mean, I feel it. We feel it about our careers, and we feel it about the times, the harsh words spoken, and the time something slipped, and we just didn't seem to, and we're constantly chased and challenged by this very idea that there is a deep lack. I'm not even talking about all the bad things we do, but also just the things we just never get to. I remember the guilt I felt about forgetting my mom's birthday. You know, it's just the most simple gestures of love that we don't make it. That's a pretty compelling vision of sin, isn't it? And a very common experience. But some of you may say to me, that's just the way I am, Chris. I mean, no, we're all sinners, right? That's just the way I am. Well, the Hebrew has another word to chase the first one, and that's the word twisted, bent. I want you to get a picture here. That God is, or what David's experience and his spiritual experience is that not only does he not make it, according to standard that's out there or in his heart, he's also somehow, in some profound way, twisted, right? Bent. No, he wasn't bent like that. He wasn't like that. But what's he trying to talk? He's trying to talk about what? A moral sense, right? Now, this starts getting a little tender, a little closer to home, right? Some of us have desires we just wish we didn't have. We know there's a shape to it, and the way the word is used in the Hebrew is not just a bentness or a distortion in your personhood, but a way you distort God's law, or a way you distort your world. And I say, this kind of word just kind of gets a little closer to home, right? It kind of starts cutting a little closer to the quick. We did a poll. I did a poll in our our staff meeting, as we went over this text this week, I was asking everybody on staff, well, what are you? Which one do you think describes you? Are you twisted? Are you falling short? Or are you rebellious? It's the third word. And everybody said, shot his hand, I'm twisted. Now, how many of us have had said this? I can't believe I just did that. Yeah. What are you saying right there? There's a distortion that I can't even get my hands around. Very visceral word. The third word, though, or let's say in the first one you say, "Well, Chris, that's just the way I am." And then God says, "Yeah, I know the way you are." Or David says, "Yes, I feel the same way." There's a third word, because our response sometimes, I'm kind of imagining our response to these kinds of understanding or self-understanding grows. And maybe if I tell you that you're twisted, you'll just go, "Well, that's not fair." Right? Like, that's the next response. "Well, that's not fair." What's the third word? Rebellious. Rebellion. David experiences that gut-wrenching sense of having missed and failed, missed the mark, followed by an inward realization that he doesn't even want good things, followed by the response to that, which is a heart that's angry at God, right? Angry and rebellious that you got this wife, or you got this husband, or you didn't get the wife you wanted, or you didn't get the career or the job, or you got the desires you didn't want, or the addictions that plague you, and you're angry about your addictions. Cycle of anger sets in. Why spend all this time on this? Because of verse 3 and 4. You see, apart from an earnest and honest self-appraisal that recognizes the brokenness and the failure, the rebellion and the twist of your soul, when you are not doing that, what happens? You are a wreck. You really are. You are stuffing in. You're pushing everything deep down inside. Now, that's such a foolish way to deal with these kind of things, isn't it? I don't know where we fall into this so stupid, foolish notion that if we take our brokenness, our failures, our distortion, and our rebellion, and if we stick it in down deep enough, it'll go away. But what really happens? It just starts simmering. The kettle just starts to rock. And what's happening to you? What's happening to you? What happens to us? And the first step of genuine spiritual experience is the recognition and the admission. The confession. All authentic spiritual experience in the Christian life begins with admitting these problems. Now, there's two things I want to notice here. First of all, this is one of the barriers to the skeptic, or those who are outside Christian experience, because you're being asked to humble yourself, to really humble in admitting. Now, some people just don't want to do that. But then even after they become Christians, some of us have known God and have known some spiritual experience in our life, but we notice it doesn't continue to grow. And I think the reason it doesn't continue to grow is because of that stuffing action, right? That David describes here is as if his bones are aching, right? And what we're being invited to, into the depth of spiritual experience for this generation, is when it finally realizes, not in nearly religious terms, sin, transgression, iniquity, but that it is plagued by and haunted by and corrupted. And then, and only then, is there a door open to what? Knowing God's love. Verse 6 is so strange. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer. We were reading that, and I was reading it with a friend, and she said, who's that? Who's talking? Who's godly to offer prayer after those first 5 verses? What has just happened? What's the transition between the end of verse 5, forgive the twistedness of my falling short, to the spiritual experience where the poet says, hey, you, Jacob, start praising. Hey, what has happened? That word there, were godly, is the same word have you ever heard of the Hasidic Jews? The Hasidim? With the black hats and the long curls, and the very conservative. It means holy ones. They use this word to identify their entire sect. But it's interesting, their entire sect is all about exterior works of godliness. What is the nature of the spiritual experience of David and his godliness in this text, in the first 5 verses? It is realizing his brokenness. And this is why Paul, as the preacher in the New Testament, uses this text to use the idea of justification. Now, the shun words are dangerous words. The shun words that end with T-I-O-N are sleepy words, right? They're sleepy words. Maybe you won't fall asleep as you hear it, but your heart gets sleepy. Shuns. Justification. Oh, yeah, that's a shun word. That's right. I wonder what I'm going to eat for lunch. We clock out. And I was debating in earnest about how can we take this passage, how can I reach into your hearts so that you will enter the experience of the wonder of justifying grace. See, justifying grace, how do I capture it? So let me, by God's grace, maybe the Holy Spirit will be present right in this moment, and together we'll experience it. Together we'll begin to glimpse it more and more. The idea is that in the cross and in the suffering, bleeding, dying, executed Jesus, his unique personhood in that moment, he is a penal substitute. He is a penal sacrifice. And where you're having fallen short, the deep twist and distortion and perversion of your nature, where the rebellion of your heart is no more, is substituted with him. And in that moment of his dying, when we as a people spiritually experience that by faith, by trusting it, something happens. And all of the goodness that's in this person, Jesus, I don't know if you know him today or even who he is, but if you'll grant for a moment that this person, Jesus, could be an amazing person of goodness and divinity, he has in him all of the goodness that can be reckoned, applied, and put into you, put on you in your account. Okay? He suffers and dies executed for the actions of failure, rebellion, and twistedness. And then he has no rebellion. He had no distortion. He did not fail. And all of that is now generously applied to you. And sometimes there's a little handle people use. Justification is just as if I'd. I don't know if you've heard that before. Just as if I'd. Instead of justified. Just as if I'd. So if we could just use it for a moment. It's just as if I'd never fallen short. That somehow in the context of God and spiritual experiences, just as if I never was distorted. And by faith I lay hold of thee. I said, it's just as if I'd never shaken my fist at God in rebellion. Oh, wait a second here. All right, well, the door to spiritual experience is David's opening it for us. And David, I don't know how he's able to do it. I mean, Paul takes it, and I think there's a spiritual nature to these texts that we can barely understand. But somehow his spiritual journey and the spiritual journey of faith is increased. It is sometimes begun, but it is increased in the believer. It is increased in the person who's knowing God, has a depth of understanding, increases of sin. So likewise, an increase of what it means for the Son to love, for God to love and call you godly, holy, pleasing, and good. What does this mean? For some of us, this is the entry to saving faith. Right this moment, you put your trust in God. You put your trust in Jesus. For some of it, is you stop propping up the gospel. Or, well, there's two things people do, right? I don't know which one you do. We can either dumb God down, right? Make him a grandfather, make him a I don't know, what do you want to make him? Some kind of sweet old fella who's winking at you, right? Morgan Freeman, if you want. Some genteel gentleman who is going to be easy on you. I want to convince you, if you think God is a genteel gentleman who will be easy on you, you are sadly mistaken. There is no such religious figure in the Scripture. That's one way. But you see, when you do that, you rob the idea that the depth of your sin has been met by the height of love. You see, you miss that. And then the door to joy doesn't open anymore. Or maybe you're a really, really, really good person. You're a really, really good CO participant, right? You're just a really, really good member of the church, a really, really good daughter, and a really, really good friend. And so what are you doing there? And all of your earnestness for righteousness is nothing less than an attempt to stay away from admitting that you're failing all the time. And Christian phonies fill our churches, right? Is it any wonder that the spiritual experience of David, which at the outset accesses his sin and turns into joy, is not what happens at St. Paul's? Is not what happens in our churches? What a sad state of affairs. We've hidden from ourselves our own brokenness, and if we can't hide it from ourselves, who do we definitely hide it from? Mom and Dad, or somebody else, or the pastor. And the kettle's boiling and screaming. Can you catch that? It's just screaming like a little kettle on the stove. You're inside, you're screaming. And the door to joy is open in believing again how sweet and fresh and abundant and full and eternal God's love is. How free and constant and available and pursuing God's love is. How constant, how wonderful, and how his justifying grace said, there is James, my beloved son. I love him. I'm so pleased with Katie. I'm so pleased with Joseph. I'm so, so pleased with Michael. That's pretty precious. That's pretty precious. But I want us to go a step further. Because some of you have bottled that and kept it as your own treasure. And that's not what David does. David completes the thought. And his completion of the thought is that his experience of spiritual awakening and the awareness of his sin that makes the awareness of God's joy and surrounding love so powerful has to do what? I will go and teach and instruct and counsel. I must become. And there's a funny thing that happens here. Many of us have been robbed of accessing grace because we're not sharing that grace. We're not in discipling relationships, either being discipled or discipling others. What is discipleship? What is evangelism? What are these works? That's what's happening here in the text. He's going out. He's going out and commanding and calling and praying and instructing. And he's got his eye. I love that language. It's very immediate. He's got his eye. So I got my eye on you. Do you have your eye on anybody to tell them that your brokenness was loved by Jesus? Do you have your eye on anybody to tell them that your constant failure has meant His constant love and has been met by justifying grace? Do you have your eye on anyone to tell them this? Is it any wonder that evangelism is at an all-time low and discipleship just a notch above it? It's because we're not entering into the valid, amazing treasure of spiritual experience that David had when he didn't even know who Christ was yet. And so when the Holy Spirit has to work to do this, I know He has to work in and work with us. And I wonder what's going to be the trigger point for this explosion of joy that happens in this text, and where His narrative of spiritual experience is your narrative. We are in danger of being Simon. Simon the pastor. Simon the pastor. Hey, Jesus, come on over for dinner. You're my friend. Have a seat. You're my friend. I'm so glad you're here. I'm a spiritual religious person, Jesus. Do you know who I am? What's that hooker doing at the door? She comes in like a tramp. She looks like a tramp. She's sleazy. She's got stiletto heels. Her dress is too tight. When she bends over, it's a show. This is awkward. This is awkward. What's she doing in the preacher's house? What's she doing here? It gets... Not only does she just come in, and she doesn't come in to say hi, she doesn't come in to greet anybody, she falls down at His feet and starts crying. Awkward. There's a hooker in the house and she's crying. Simon's sitting there and we're just like Simon. What are you doing, Jesus? What are you doing, Jesus? She's crying so much her tears are like a bath for His feet. And she has perfume to put there. She is a wreck. Awkward. Can you say awkward? It says that Jesus discerned Simon's thoughts. I don't think they were all that easy to read. Do you? Can you see the expression on your mom's face? Can you see it in your own heart? And I love Jesus turns to Simon like He's turning to us today, and He says, Simon, I have something I want to say to you. Adam, I have something I want to say to you. St. Paul says, I have something I want to say to you. There was a guy who lent money out, and one guy, he loaned him $10,000 to buy a car. Another guy, he loaned $200,000 to buy a house. And he was making a lot of money, so he brought them both in, and he told the guy who bought a car for him, he forgave that debt. He said, it's fine. I want to share with you my largesse. I want to give you out of my bounty. And he forgave the debt of the car. And then he brought in the guy who he loaned money to a house, $200,000. He said, and I want to forgive you all the debt for your home. And Jesus said, Simon, who do you think loved that guy more? Who do you think loved that guy more? The one who was forgiven 20,000 or the one who's forgiven 200? Well, that's a dumb question. Anybody can do the math. We all know how we would respond. The guy who was forgiven $200,000. And the guy with 20 grand sitting there saying, I wish I'd gone to deeper debt. And then he looks at Simon. Who knows if this was a saving moment for him? Who knows if this is a saving spiritual moment for you? I don't know. He who has been forgiven much loves much. And the reason evangelism isn't happening in the church of Jesus Christ and isn't happening at St. Paul's, and discipleship gets pushed to the back burner, half of us are even later, we're not doing a reading, or we're not really investing in others' lives, is because we are not animated with great forgiveness, because we refuse to come to the well as needy, broken, wretched people. So there's nothing exploding. What a travesty.